Greetings from First United Methodist Church of Los Alamos, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. We have now resumed in-person worship with one service at 10 a.m., which is live streamed both on Facebook and on YouTube. We alternate each week between contemporary and traditional music. You may confirm worship times and receive more information by visiting our website, firstinyourheart.org. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
Our first reading comes from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Paul is in some conflict with the church in Corinth following the visit of what he calls the super apostles, who are bragging about how important and great they are. Paul wants to make sure the church understands that it is Christ who shines in us, not us shining for ourselves. Hear what the Spirit says to the church. For we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of the darkness," who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this journey, treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So, death is at work in us, but life in you. Our second reading is from the Gospel of Mark. This takes place early in Jesus' ministry as he is finishing calling the disciples, teaching and healing. Immediately before today's passage, he is asking why he and the disciples aren't fasting like the others. That is, why they are following proper behavior for those who claim to be faithful to God, why they are not following proper behavior for those who claim to be faithful to God. He rebukes them and says he is bringing a new message, new wine for new wineskins. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the cornfields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. This is the good news of Jesus Christ.
Thanks be to God. So on Monday, as most of us were off to observe Memorial Day, I read an article by someone who was arguing that we should stop celebrating Memorial Day. His reasoning was because that we don't really do what the holiday was set aside for, which is to go to cemeteries to honor those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for their countries in dying in battle. And because most people now are much more separated from the times when we lost large numbers of soldiers in war, he said that we should therefore stop celebrating because we weren't doing what Memorial Day was set aside for. Now, I will state in fairness to the author that his argument then went on to we should actually combine Memorial Day and Veterans Day together, since most people don't even know what the difference of those two are. And that we should consider rethinking all holidays, removing some that we celebrate and perhaps adding others that we might celebrate. But what struck me in that article, especially as I was thinking about today when we're talking about Sabbath, was that he believed that because we didn't celebrate in the right way, that we shouldn't celebrate at all. That if we were just using that holiday for barbecuing or hiking or watching baseball or whatever it might be, we shouldn't get to take the day off because we were doing it wrong. And so maybe it's a stretch to try and connect that idea with how we sometimes get worked up about Sabbath, or how some people get worked up about it. Because it seems similar to me in some of the rules that we try to make about Sabbath, or rules that others want to make about Sabbath that apply to others, that we sometimes get caught in these binds of, if you're not doing it right, then obviously you're doing it wrong. And let's be honest that the rules that we tend to think about for Sabbath that took place during Jesus' time, and how we think they're a little crazy, really aren't all that different from other rules that have been applied to Sabbath in our own time. Most of us remember when there were blue laws, right, to keep you from doing anything on Sunday. And even today, you might have read in the news last week that a stretch of beach in Ocean Grove, New Jersey, has been ordered by the courts to be open to the public on Sunday morning, but it's been closed because of blue laws since the mid-18th century. And in one of the ironies of that, you could use the beach after noon, but you couldn't use it in the morning. Then it was closed because let's not get crazy, right? You should have some fun, but just not before noon so you can be in church. If the beach is there, you certainly wouldn't want to miss out on church. And we do all of these things while also conveniently ignoring the fact that Sunday is not actually the Sabbath. The Sabbath is still Saturday. We worship on the first day of the week because that's when Jesus was resurrected. And so that in and of itself should help us to move beyond some of the rules that we like to apply, or again, others want to apply to us, and how we think about taking a day of rest and what works for us and what doesn't. And so in that passage from Mark we heard this morning, Jesus and the disciples are traveling on the Sabbath. And in the passage that comes immediately before this, we are told that they are not fasting as John's disciples are doing. And that becomes important because hunger or starvation could be a reason why it would be allowed to violate Sabbath law. And so they're walking along and they pull out the pluck the heads of grain and they eat them. And others seeing this say, well, clearly they're reaping, which means they're doing work on the Sabbath, which is forbidden, right? If they had been starving, that would be okay, but clearly they're not because we've just been told they're not fasting at all. And I think it's easy, perhaps too easy, to start throwing mud at all those people who are making those rules, about how ridiculous they think we are, especially as we think about, right, often the idea of who Pharisees are much more concerned with rules than they are with kindness or compassion, right? They're going to punish anybody who breaks these sort of arbitrary rules that get established. And it's easy to make judgments against those who want to do that, except we should remember that Jesus says that the judgment you use will be the judgment used against you. And let me give a possible defense for the rules that get established. It comes from the fact that Scripture tells us that we are to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. But it doesn't really tell us how to do that, of what we should and shouldn't be doing. There's some guidelines, but they're pretty rough. And so people are thinking, well, if we're supposed to observe this, right, God is telling us to do this, we want to do it right. We don't want to be violating God's law, so we need to start thinking about these things. So as I already said, still happens, people then try and come up with rules to make sure we're doing it in the right way. And those rules are not always in agreement. Even in Jesus' day, there was still lots of debates amongst the rabbis of what rules you should follow and what rules you shouldn't. What Sabbath literally means is to stop or to cease. And there are two reasons given in Scripture why we are to practice the Sabbath. Most of you know the first one from the creation story. God creates for 6 days, right? Works for 6 days and then rests on the seventh day. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. So therefore, we should follow God's lead. The other reason comes after the Exodus, and God says you should follow the Sabbath because you were once slaves in Egypt. And you didn't control when you worked or when you didn't. You didn't control your own labor, and I have set you free. Therefore, now you have control over what you do. And by taking that control, you also follow what I tell you to do, which is to take this day of rest. And in that injunction of having been slaves in Egypt, the commandment is also that their whole household, including slaves and animals, are also to be given this day of rest. And so clearly part of the understanding of Sabbath is about work and about not working. But again, what that means and how we do that is where all these arguments come into place. And so in response to people accusing the disciples and Jesus of violating the Sabbath by clearly reaping in these fields, Jesus gives an example that really doesn't have anything to do with the Sabbath at all, but about laws, about what you can and can't do with the bread of the presence in the tents, right, eventually becomes the temple, that only the priests are allowed to eat. And so David goes into the tent, and the only bread that's available is the bread of the presence, and so he demands that it be given to he and his men, which the priest does, because they are hungry, right? There's some caveat of why this rule is allowed to be broken. And maybe it's not exactly the same equivalent here, but since the disciples are traveling on the Sabbath, and it appears that they are not carrying their own food, if they had then gone into the city and asked for people to provide them with food, either the people would then have to cook it for them, which would be a violation of Sabbath law, or they would have to provide them the food they already had they prepared the day before, which is still common within Judaism for those who practice Sabbath, right? You prepare your food the day before so you don't have to work on the Sabbath. So if they said, give us food, then they would have less food to practice the Sabbath. And so perhaps this is actually an act of kindness, right? Of mercy, that the disciples are not putting this burden onto other people. It's an act of compassion. And we could say a lot about right, the exceptions to Jewish law that the rabbis debate. We don't have time for that, but that plays a large role in trying to understand how these rules get applied. But then Jesus says what's at the heart of the matter for today's message. The Sabbath was made for humankind. Humankind was not made for the Sabbath. Now, one of the ways that this often gets interpreted has been sort of on the anything goes side, right? If the Sabbath is made for us, then we get to do whatever it is that we want to do. Maybe even up to not recognizing the Sabbath at all. And I get that interpretation, right? When there's all these rules that we want to try to overcome, that makes sense to go in that direction. But that sense of permissiveness has to be tempered by what Jesus says immediately after that, which is the fact that he says, the Son of Man, Jesus, is the Lord of the Sabbath. So that means Jesus is really the one who then controls what we do and don't do on Sabbath. Although, again, we don't really get any more guidance from Jesus on this than we get from God in the Hebrew Scriptures. And so I think we have to find sort of that middle, the Goldilocks spot between total permissiveness and total rules, where we recognize the need for Sabbath, the need to stop, the need to rest, but also to recognize that how we do that is to a large degree up to us. Because the reality is that what is relaxing and refreshing, what is healing and restoring to me might be totally different for you. So I spent a large portion of Memorial Day laying around the house reading. I woke up that morning with a little less than 6 hours remaining in the book I was reading, and I thought, it'd be great if I could finish this today, and I did. But I know for some of you, thinking about reading for 6 hours would be torture. Right? That is not how you want to spend your day off. Abigail would definitely be shaking her head on that, right? Others like, yeah, could I spend 10 hours? That would be even better. So we have to know that Sabbath plays different things for different people depending on who we are and what we need. Right? So there's several reasons we follow Sabbath. One of them is because God commands it. To give this time to God, not in productive work that we are normally taking place, and to take this time to set it aside, to be intentional about time. So that we are recognizing what is Kairos time, God's time, not Chronos time, which is watching the clock. And it's also about knowing that if we give this day up, of trusting God that we're not going to go belly up for whatever it is that we do, right? Taking this one day isn't going to destroy everything that we work on the other 6 days. And to build on that, it's about saying or admitting that we are more than what we do. Is to find that sense of identity not in our work, but in our belonging to God. We'll come back to that more next week. And it's about pushing aside, away the busyness, the hecticness of life. It's about taking time for our souls to catch up if we've been going so fast that we leave them behind. And so it's about restoring ourselves. To recreate literally means to recreate. And so as we think about what we do or don't do for our Sabbath rest, I think the key that we have to keep in mind is, does what we do promote restoration and renewal? Does it bring about healing and wholeness? If it's not doing those things, then it's not Sabbath rest. right? I know people in here for whom gardening is one of those restorative moments that they can do. They go out and spend several hours out in the garden, and that can be a prayerful activity, and they come back in, right, just, man, that was the best time I could have spent. I spend several hours gardening. I come back in exhausted because it's just work for me, right? It's not renewing to my soul in any way. But it is for them. And so we have to find those things that restore and renew us. And if we do take that Sabbath day, it's not about then trying to catch up on all those other things that we do. I can say I take off one day a week, and how do I often spend a portion of that day? Catching up on all the work around the house, right? Mowing the lawn, doing all that work. That is not Sabbath. I can tell you from my own practice, that's not Sabbath. I need to do better at that. We all need to do better at that. That's where the hard work comes into play. And so if you are using the rules about Sabbath as a cudgel to beat yourself up, or others are using them against you, or you're using them against others, stop. Sabbath is about saying we need time off. God says you need to do this. And then we get to decide what it is that we do, how we practice that. Although I would also strongly encourage you to take a Sabbath from your phone or social media or bombardment or news or all those other things that surround us, that distract us and keep us running at 1,000 miles an hour during the week. Instead, find and do those things that you are excited about, that you are passionate about, the things that make you want to get out of bed in the morning that you don't get time during the rest of the week to do. Do the things that promote restoration and renewal, that bring healing and wholeness to you. Because we only get one go around at life. As the old cliche says, no one ever says on their deathbed, I wish I would have worked more. Sabbath is important. Rest is important. And it doesn't have to be on Sunday. It doesn't have to be on Saturday, right? You have to find the time that works for you. And if you are not doing this at all, start small. Pick a couple of hours. Pick out a time, put it on your calendar, and say, this is when I'm going to do my Sabbath rest. And then build up from there. It doesn't even have to be 24 hours straight, right? You could take the same period of time every single day. Say, this is my Sabbath rest. And that can simply be blocking more time out. If you're not getting at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, blocking more time out so you can get that, because that will bring healing and restoration and better health for you. Those all can be Sabbath activities because they can be restorative and renewing. They can bring healing and wholeness. We were not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us so that we can rest, so that we can find that time to simply be and to be with God. I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters. Amen.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to follow our YouTube channel and Twitter, and like us on Facebook if you haven't already. And remember that every action you take today could change someone's life. So make sure it's a good one and be an agent of love. God bless.